The moment a man stops choosing himself, is the moment the universe decides what he's worth. The warning light didn't blink anymore, it just burned, a steady red glow reflecting across the fractured glass of Ethan Cole's helmet as the last fragments of his shuttle drifted past him in slow silence, each piece spinning like it had forgotten gravity ever existed, and maybe it had, because out here there was no up, no down, just distance measured in miles of emptiness and the quiet hum of a suit running on its final reserves. His oxygen readout hovered at 3%, flickering. Unstable, and the temperature outside had already dropped past -200°F, numbers that would have terrified anyone still thinking about survival, but Ethan wasn't thinking about survival, not anymore, because the last transmission he had sent hadn't been a distress call for himself, it had been a rerouted signal, one he had manually overridden, one that pointed rescuers toward a civilian transport drifting blind on the far edge of the debris field, a ship his own. Command had ordered ignored, he had heard their voices before the comms went dead, sharp, efficient, detached, telling him to stand down, telling him the civilians were expendable, telling him that one officer's obedience mattered more than 100 unknown lives, and Ethan had made his choice in less than a second, fingers moving faster than fear, redirecting power, locking coordinates, and sealing his own fate with a quiet breath that fogged the inside of his visor. Now the silence pressed in, thick and absolute, broken only by the faint hiss of leaking air somewhere behind his shoulder, and the slow, measured beat of his own pulse echoing through the suit's audio pickups, steady, calm, like it hadn't noticed the difference between life and the edge of it. Far beyond the drifting wreckage, a shape moved, massive and deliberate, its silhouette cutting across the starlight like a thought too large to ignore, but it didn't rush in, didn't flare engines or broadcast signals, it simply watched, its hull lined with faint blue illumination that pulsed once every few seconds, as if measuring time in a way no human ever had, and inside that vessel, behind layers of crystalline interface and living metal, Empress Lyra Vera stood in absolute stillness, her gaze fixed on the lone figure tumbling through open space, her eyes reflecting data streams that painted Ethan Cole not as a man, but as a series of choices, decisions, variables that refused to align with any known model of self-preservation. He redirected the signal. One of her advisors said quietly, their voice edged with disbelief, he ensured the survival of others at the cost of his own extraction window, but Lyra did not respond, not yet, because what interested her was not the act itself, but the absence of hesitation before it, the way his biometric readings had spiked for less than a second before stabilizing, the way his neural patterns showed clarity instead of panic, as if he had already accepted the outcome before making the decision. And that was something her empire had no word for. Outside, Ethan's vision began to narrow, stars stretching at the edges as the suit dimmed non-essential systems, conserving what little remained, and he exhaled slowly, watching the vapor fade, not fighting, not struggling, just waiting, but not for rescue, never for that, because he had learned what rescue meant when it came from people who measured worth in efficiency, and for the first time since the betrayal, there was no anger left in him, only a quiet certainty that he had not become what they wanted him to be. The massive vessel shifted then, almost imperceptibly, its engines awakening with a low, resonant hum that never reached him, and within its core, Lyra finally spoke, her voice calm, precise, carrying the weight of a decision that would ripple far beyond this moment. Continue observation, she said, though her eyes never left the human drifting alone against the infinite dark. I want to see if he begs, or if he remains exactly what he has chosen to be. A man who has nothing left to lose should be the most dangerous thing in the universe. But he was not. The numbers faded first, the oxygen display dissolving into a dim smear of red before vanishing entirely, leaving Ethan Cole alone with the quiet rhythm of his breathing growing thinner with every passing second, each inhale a little shallower, each exhale a little slower, like his body was learning how to let go without asking permission, and still he did not reach for the emergency override on his suit, did not trigger the last reserve injector that might buy him a few more minutes. Because he had already made his choice and there was no part of him that wanted to undo it. Far across the vacuum, the civilian transport he had saved drifted steadily toward a rescue vector, its beacon now strong, its path corrected, and that was enough, more than enough, even if he would never see the outcome, even if no one would ever know what he had done, because recognition had never been part of the equation, only the result. Inside the silent observation chamber, Lyra Vera watched as the human's vital signs slowed into a pattern that her systems flagged as terminal but stable, a contradiction that made her narrow her eyes slightly, her fingers hovering above a translucent interface that displayed layers of data she had reviewed 100 times already, yet still could not categorize. He has not attempted self-preservation, one of her counselors noted, their tone careful, uncertain, no distress signal, no override, no attempt to redirect energy back to his own systems, and Lyra finally spoke, her voice low, measured, carrying no emotion yet impossible to ignore. He redirected everything before it mattered. She said, as if the answer had been there all along, as if the moment of decision had defined everything that followed. Outside, Ethan's vision narrowed further, the stars no longer sharp points but soft streaks of light bending at the edges, and somewhere in the fading distance, he thought he saw movement, a shadow crossing the void, but his mind did not chase it, did not question it, because curiosity required energy and he had none left to spend, only a quiet acceptance that settled deeper. With each heartbeat, slower now, heavier, like it was counting down to something that no longer felt like an ending, the massive vessel adjusted its position again, this time closer, close enough that its presence distorted the starlight around Ethan's drifting form, close enough that the systems within registered a critical threshold had been reached, and still Lyra did not give the command to retrieve him, not yet, because there was one variable she had not resolved, one final question that no scan could answer. Increase audio sensitivity, she ordered, and the chamber filled with the faintest signal, a barely detectable vibration carried through the vacuum by the failing systems of a dying suit. Translated, amplified, turned into something that could be understood, and for the first time, they heard him. Ethan's voice was not strong, not clear, but it was steady, shaped by a breath that did not expect to be heard. Just make it count, he murmured, the words slipping out like they were meant for no one but himself, and in that moment, something shifted behind Lyra's eyes, not emotion, not yet, but recognition. The kind that rewrites assumptions without asking permission. He speaks without audience, the counselor whispered, almost to themselves. He affirms a choice that yields no reward, and Lyra finally lowered her hand, the decision forming not from logic, but from something that felt dangerously close to understanding. Prepare retrieval, she said, her voice unchanged yet carrying a weight that silenced the room instantly. But do not revive him immediately, she added after a brief pause, her gaze still fixed on the human drifting at the edge of existence. I want to see what remains, when survival is no longer the reason. Sometimes the line between life and death is not a boundary, it is a question. The retrieval field shimmered into existence around Ethan Cole without sound, a soft distortion in the darkness that bent light instead of breaking it, and for a moment his drifting form seemed to hesitate, as if even the universe needed confirmation before letting him be taken back. Then slowly, almost gently, he was pulled inward, drawn across the invisible threshold and into the vast interior of a ship that did not rush, did not flare, did not celebrate the act of saving a life, because to them, it was not yet a rescue, it was an observation continuing under different conditions. His suit registered the change first, a faint stabilization in pressure, a slight increase in ambient warmth measured in fractions of a degree, but there was no sudden return, no dramatic surge, only a gradual easing, like the environment itself was deciding how much to give back and when. Inside the medical chamber, Ethan's body lay suspended within a translucent field that held him perfectly still, his breathing shallow but present, his heart tracing a slow, deliberate rhythm that refused to fully surrender. And across the room, Lyra Vera stepped closer, her presence quiet yet absolute, her gaze moving not over him, but through the data that unfolded with each passing second, every metric recorded, every fluctuation analyzed, yet none of it answering the question that had followed him from the moment she first saw him drifting alone. Neural activity remains consistent. An attendant reported, their tone controlled but edged with something unfamiliar. There is no sign of panic response, no reactive aggression, no attempt to regain control, and Lyra tilted her head slightly, her luminous eyes narrowing as she studied the human not as a specimen, but as a contradiction that refused to resolve, because everything about him suggested he should fight, should resist, should demand explanation or control, and yet he did none of those things. Time passed differently within the chamber, measured not in minutes but in responses, in the absence of them, and when Ethan's eyes finally opened, it was not sudden, not dramatic, but slow, deliberate, like waking was a choice he was not entirely certain he wanted to make, his vision adjusting to the soft ambient light that carried no clear source, his breath catching slightly as his lungs drew in air that felt too clean, too precise, and for a moment, he did not move, did not speak, simply existing in the space between awareness and decision. Lyra watched closely, her hands resting behind her back. Posture perfect, unreadable, and when he finally turned his head, when his gaze found hers across the chamber, there was no fear in it, no confusion that demanded immediate answers, only a quiet recognition that something had changed, and then, after a long second that stretched just enough to matter, he spoke, his voice steady despite everything his body had endured. Did they make it? And the room stilled, every system continuing its silent function while the weight of that question settled into something far greater than the words themselves. Lyra did not answer immediately, because the question had not been directed at her authority, not at her power, but at something simpler, something she was only beginning to understand, and when she finally responded, her voice carried the same calm precision it always had, yet beneath it, there was a shift so subtle it could not be measured. They were recovered, she said, watching closely for any change, any reaction that would confirm or deny the pattern she had observed, and Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in acknowledgement. A small exhale leaving him like a weight had been lifted that had nothing to do with survival. And when he opened them again, he did not ask where he was, did not demand explanation, did not reach for control, he simply looked at her and said, "Then you did what mattered," and in that moment, Lyra Vera understood something her empire had never taught her, something no system had ever defined, that this human did not measure existence by what he was given, but by what was preserved beyond himself. And that made him something entirely new. Power does not reveal who a man is, it reveals what he refuses to become. The chamber adjusted its light as Ethan Cole slowly sat upright, the support field lowering just enough to allow movement but not enough to suggest freedom, and he noticed that immediately, not as a threat, not even as a restriction, but as a detail, something to be understood before it was judged, his eyes scanning the curved architecture around him, the seamless surfaces, the faint hum of systems that did not resemble anything human yet operated with a precision he could feel more than hear. His breathing had stabilized now, each inhale steady, controlled, and though his body carried the lingering weight of exhaustion, his posture did not reflect weakness, only awareness, as if he had already accepted where he was and was simply waiting for the reason to arrive. Lyra Vera remained where she stood, observing not just his movements but the absence of certain reactions, no demand for explanation, no visible anger, no instinct to assert control over a situation that was clearly not his. And that absence continued to unsettle the logic that had guided her empire for centuries. "You are not under restraint," she said finally, her voice calm, precise. "Filling the space without effort, the field exists to maintain your recovery," and Ethan glanced briefly at the faint shimmer around him before looking back at her, not questioning the statement, not testing it, simply accepting it as fact until proven otherwise. "Then it is doing its job," he replied, his tone even, without edge or challenge, and that, more than defiance ever could, drew the attention of every observer in the room. A pause followed, not empty, but heavy with the weight of two different ways of understanding the same moment, and Lyra took a single step closer, the soft glow of her presence reflecting across the chamber's surface as she studied him with a focus that had nothing to do with rank or protocol. "Your own kind abandoned you," she stated, not as an accusation, but as a measured observation, and for the first time, something shifted behind Ethan's eyes, not anger, not bitterness, but recognition, the kind that comes from having already processed the truth. "Long before it is spoken aloud, they made a decision," he said after a moment, his voice quiet but steady. "It just was not one I agreed with," and the simplicity of that answer created a ripple of silence that no system could quantify, because it carried no resentment, no demand for justice, only a boundary drawn by principle instead of emotion. Lyra's gaze sharpened slightly, her interest deepening as she continued. "You chose others over your own survival," she said, "even after their betrayal," and Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the motion controlled, deliberate, as if every movement still passed through a filter of thought before becoming action. "I chose what I could live with," he answered, and then, after the briefest pause, added, "or die with," and there it was again, that contradiction, that refusal to align with the patterns her empire understood, a being who did not measure worth by survival, but by consistency, around them, the chamber remained silent, the observers present but unseen, their attention fixed on the exchange unfolding in front of them, waiting for a break, a flaw, a moment where the human would reveal the instinct they expected, but it did not come. Lyra straightened slightly, her posture shifting not in dominance, but in recognition of something that required a different approach. "In my empire," she said, her voice carrying a subtle change, not softer, but more deliberate, "loyalty defines worth," and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation, his expression calm, grounded. "Then your empire and I define it differently," he replied, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not agreement, not conflict, but the beginning of understanding that neither of them had expected to find, especially not here, in a place where one had been left behind, and the other had chosen to watch instead of act. Understanding does not begin when two sides agree, it begins when neither side walks away. The chamber doors did not open with sound, only a subtle shift in the air pressure that Ethan Cole felt more than heard, and beyond the threshold, a corridor stretched into a distance that seemed longer than it should have been, its walls alive with faint streams of light moving like silent currents beneath the surface, guiding rather than illuminating, and for a moment, he remained where he was, not out of hesitation, but because he recognized the invitation for what it was, not an order, not a command, but a choice. Lyra Vera turned slightly, her posture unchanged yet unmistakably directing the moment forward. "You may walk," she said, her voice even, without insistence, and Ethan stepped forward without asking permission, the support field dissolving the instant his foot crossed its boundary, leaving him standing on solid ground that responded with a faint, almost imperceptible adjustment to his weight, as if the ship itself acknowledged his presence. They moved together through the corridor in silence, not the empty kind, but the kind that carries observation, each step measured, each detail absorbed, Ethan noting the absence of guards, the lack of visible weapons, the way the environment did not feel like containment but like a system designed for something far more deliberate, and Lyra, in turn, noting the way he did not attempt to map exits, did not glance for vulnerabilities, did not treat the space as something to escape, but as something to understand. "You are not concerned," she said after a time, her voice breaking the silence without disrupting it, and Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward her before returning forward. "Concern requires a reason," he replied, his tone calm, grounded. "So far, I have not been given one," and that answer lingered between them, not as reassurance, but as a reflection of trust that had not been requested, and had not been earned in any conventional way. The corridor opened into a wider chamber, one that overlooked the vast expanse beyond the vessel, a transparent barrier revealing stars stretched across the darkness in a way that felt closer than they had any right to be, and Ethan slowed slightly, not stopping, just enough to take it in, the scale, the quiet, the sense of distance that reminded him exactly where he was and how far he had come from anything familiar. Lyra watched him, not the stars, but the way he reacted to them, or rather, the way he did not, no awe, no visible shock, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if the universe itself was something he had already made peace with. "Most would see this and feel small," she said, her voice softer now, though no less controlled, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes still on the endless field beyond. "Most people are looking for their place in it," he answered. "I already know mine," and for the first time, Lyra felt the subtle shift of something she could not categorize, not uncertainty, but the awareness that the framework she relied on did not fully apply here. A group of figures stood at the far end of the chamber, their forms distinct yet unified in posture, waiting, observing, their presence carrying the unmistakable weight of authority, and as Ethan and Lyra approached, the air itself seemed to tighten, not with hostility, but with expectation. One of them stepped forward slightly, their voice measured, precise. "This is the human," they said, not a question, and Lyra did not look at them, her gaze remaining forward, steady. "This is the one who chose," she replied, and Ethan felt the weight of that statement more than the words themselves, not as a title, not as recognition, but as something else entirely, something that had yet to reveal its full meaning, and as the silence settled once more, he realized that whatever came next, was not going to be decided for him. The moment someone questions your worth is not when you defend it, it is when you decide whether they deserve to measure it. The chamber did not change, but the air within it did, shifting subtly as the gathered figures stepped forward one by one, their presence deliberate, their movements precise, each of them carrying a weight that did not need to be announced, and Ethan Cole felt it immediately, not as pressure, but as attention, focused, measured, assessing him not as an individual alone but as a variable introduced into a system that did not tolerate unpredictability. The one who had spoken earlier took another step closer, their eyes narrowing slightly as they studied him without hesitation. "You stand before authority that governs systems beyond your comprehension," they said, their voice even, controlled, yet edged with something that resembled doubt rather than dominance, "and yet you show no acknowledgement of that position," and Ethan did not react immediately, not out of defiance, but because the statement itself required no correction, only context, which he provided after a brief pause, his voice steady, unforced. "I acknowledge what I see," he said, his gaze moving calmly between them. "Power is not something I ignore, it is something I choose how to respond to," and the simplicity of that answer created a momentary silence that did not feel like approval or rejection, but like a recalibration of expectation. Lyra Vera remained slightly behind him now, not hidden, not withdrawn, but allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption, her attention fixed not on the council, but on Ethan, on the way he held himself without tension, without submission, as if he had already resolved the outcome regardless of what was decided here. Another figure spoke, their tone sharper, more direct. "Your kind abandoned you," they said, echoing the earlier truth but with a different intent. "By all known metrics, your loyalty should be fractured, your judgment compromised," and this time Ethan responded without delay, his expression unchanged. "My judgment is exactly why I am here," he replied, his voice calm but carrying a quiet certainty that did not need to rise to be heard. "I did not lose it when they made their choice, so I am not going to lose it now." And again, the room absorbed the answer, not dismissing it, not accepting it, but recognizing that it did not fit the outcome they had predicted. The first speaker shifted slightly, their posture tightening just enough to suggest a new approach. "Then answer this," they said, "if your own people found you expendable, why should we not reach the same conclusion?" And the question settled into the space between them, heavier than any that had come before, because it was not a test of reaction, but of value, and Ethan took a slow breath before answering, not searching for the right words, but allowing the truth to settle. Before he spoke, "Because I did not change," he said simply, his eyes steady, unwavering. "Their decision did not redefine what I am willing to stand for," and for the first time, the silence that followed carried something different, not tension, not calculation, but the faint outline of understanding beginning to form. Lyra stepped forward then, her presence shifting the balance of the room without effort, her voice cutting through the quiet with calm precision. "You measure worth through alignment," she said, addressing the council, "through loyalty to structure, to command, to outcome," and then her gaze moved to Ethan, not questioning, but recognizing. "He measures it through consistency," she continued, "through a principle that does not adjust based on who is watching," and the distinction settled heavily, because it was not a defense, it was a redefinition, one that challenged the foundation they had always relied on. Ethan did not react to her words, did not acknowledge them directly, but something in his posture shifted, not in pride, not in relief, but in acceptance, as if the truth being spoken had never needed validation, only recognition. And as the council stood in silence, processing what had just been placed before them, it became clear that the question was no longer whether the human belonged here, but whether their system could afford to ignore what he represented. A system does not fear what it understands, it fears what it cannot control. The silence in the chamber did not break, it deepened, settling into something heavier as the council remained still, their attention fixed not on Ethan Cole alone, but on the implication of his presence, because what stood before them was not a threat in any conventional sense, not a force, not a weapon, but something far more difficult to categorize, a constant in a system built entirely on variables. One of the council members shifted slightly, their voice measured but no longer as certain. As before, consistency without allegiance is instability, they said, their gaze narrowing. A being who does not bend cannot be integrated, and Ethan listened without interruption, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as if the statement had already been considered and filed away long before it was spoken aloud, and when he responded, his voice carried no resistance, only clarity. "Then maybe integration is not the goal," he said, and that answer did not challenge their authority, it bypassed it entirely, forcing a different question into the space between them. Lyra Vera stepped forward again, her presence shifting the balance without effort, her eyes reflecting a decision forming not from protocol, but from observation refined into understanding. You assume rigidity, she said to the council, her tone precise, but what you are witnessing is not resistance, it is alignment that does not depend on external command, and she turned slightly toward Ethan, not to question him, but to confirm something she already recognized. You did not act against your kind, she continued, you acted in accordance with something they chose to ignore, and Ethan met her gaze briefly, not as validation, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement. They had their priorities, he said quietly, I have mine, and again. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any declaration could. Another council member spoke, their voice lower now, more contemplative, and if your priorities conflict with ours, they asked, not as a challenge, but as a necessary conclusion, and Ethan did not hesitate this time, his answer immediate, grounded, then I will make the same choice, he said, and the chamber seemed to hold its breath around those words, not because of defiance, but because of the certainty behind them, the absence of negotiation, the quiet acceptance that outcome did not change principle. Lyra observed the reaction closely, noting the shift, the recalibration happening in real time as the council processed what had just been stated, because this was no longer about whether Ethan could be trusted in the traditional sense, it was about whether a system that relied on control could function alongside something that did not require it. She turned fully toward the council now, her posture straight, her voice carrying the authority that had always been unquestioned, yet now directed toward something new. Then the question is not whether he aligns with us, she said, but whether we are capable of aligning with something that does not need us to define it, and that statement settled into the chamber like a line drawn across everything they believed to be stable. Ethan remained still, not reacting to the weight of the moment, not stepping forward or back, simply present, as if the outcome of this exchange had never been about winning or losing, but about remaining unchanged. Regardless of what followed, and as the silence stretched once more, longer now, deeper, it became clear that the next decision would not be about the human at all, it would be about whether an empire built on control could recognize the value of something it could never fully command. A throne is not given to the strongest, it is given to the one who cannot be replaced. The chamber did not erupt, it did not fracture into argument or resistance, it simply shifted, the kind of shift that happens when a truth settles too deeply to be ignored, and one by one, the members of the council adjusted their stance, not in submission, but in recalibration, their silence no longer defensive, but contemplative, as if they were witnessing the edge of something their system had never accounted for. Lyra Vera stepped forward into the center of that silence, her presence no longer just authoritative, but decisive, her gaze sweeping across the council before returning to Ethan Cole, who stood exactly as he had from the beginning, unchanged, unbent, and that was the point. You seek predictability, she said, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable finality, you seek alignment that can be measured, directed, and controlled, and her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in clarity. But what you have before you is not instability, it is certainty that does not depend on you, and the distinction landed heavily, because it reframed everything they had just witnessed, not as a risk, but as a constant beyond their reach. One of the council members inclined their head slightly, their voice quieter now, stripped of earlier rigidity. And you believe this human should stand within our structure, they asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine uncertainty, and Lyra did not hesitate. No, she said simply, and that single word created a pause, sharper than any disagreement could have, because it removed the expectation entirely. He should not stand within it, she continued, her gaze steady, unwavering, he should stand beside it, and for the first time, the implication became clear, not integration, not assimilation, but elevation beyond the framework itself. Ethan's eyes shifted slightly toward her, not in surprise, not even in curiosity, but in recognition of the weight behind her words, because he understood what she was doing, even if he did not yet understand why. Another council member spoke, their tone cautious, to place him outside the structure is to place him beyond control, and Lyra's response came without delay, he already is, she said, and the simplicity of that truth silenced any remaining resistance, because it could not be argued, not after everything they had observed. She turned fully toward Ethan now, closing the distance between them with measured steps. Her presence no longer that of an observer, but of a ruler making a choice that would redefine more than a single life. You were evaluated without your knowledge, she said, her voice even, transparent in a way that carried no deception. You were given no incentive, no audience, no promise of survival, and still, you remained consistent. And she stopped just in front of him, her gaze meeting his directly, not above him, not through him, but at equal level. That is the standard my empire claims to value, she continued, but rarely encounters, and the chamber seemed to narrow around that moment. Every presence focused on what would come next, because they all understood that this was no longer a discussion, it was a decision. Ethan held her gaze, not resisting, not yielding, simply present, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm certainty it always had. Then what happens now? He asked, not as a demand, but as a question that acknowledged the weight of what was being offered without assuming its outcome. Lyra's expression did not change, but something in her presence did, something quieter, more deliberate, as she answered. Now, she said, we stop deciding what you are worth, and start recognizing it. And in that moment, the council did not object, did not intervene, because they understood that the decision had already been made long before this chamber. It had been made the moment a human chose others, with no one watching, and no reason to do so except that it was right. In the end, a throne is not a place you sit, it is a responsibility you refuse to betray. The chamber remained still, but the silence no longer carried tension, it carried acceptance, the kind that settles slowly, like gravity finding its place again after being questioned. And Ethan Cole stood at the center of it, not elevated, not diminished, simply unchanged, which now meant something entirely different than it had before. Lyra Vera turned away from the council first, not dismissing them, but concluding what no longer required debate. Her steps measured as she moved toward the far end of the chamber where the transparent wall revealed the vast expanse beyond. Stars stretching endlessly across the dark, silent and absolute, and for a moment she said nothing, allowing the space between decision and declaration to exist, to settle, to be understood. Ethan followed after a brief pause, not because he was commanded to, but because he chose to, his footsteps quiet against the seamless floor, his presence steady, and when he came to stand beside her, there was no distance between them that implied hierarchy, only perspective, shared and unspoken. My empire has ruled for centuries, Lyra said at last, her voice calm, carrying the weight of history without needing to emphasize it, built on order, structure, and the belief that control ensures survival. And her gaze remained fixed on the stars, as if the answer she sought had always been somewhere beyond them. But control is not the same as understanding, she added, and that was not a correction of her people, but an evolution of them. Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he lacked words, but because he understood that this moment was not about filling silence, it was about recognizing it. And when he did speak, his voice was as steady as it had always been. Then maybe this is where it changes, he said, and Lyra glanced toward him, not surprised, not questioning, but acknowledging the simplicity of a truth that did not require complexity to be valid. Behind them, the council remained, their presence no longer opposing, no longer uncertain, but observant, as if witnessing something that could not be undone, not because of power, but because of meaning. Lyra turned fully toward Ethan then, her posture straight, her expression composed, yet carrying a quiet shift that no system could measure. You were offered nothing when you made your choice, she said, her voice precise, no reward, no recognition, no guarantee of survival, and she stepped closer, closing the final distance between them, not to impose, but to present. That is why it holds value beyond anything we could offer, she continued, and for the first time, the word that had remained unspoken began to take form, not as an object, not as a symbol, but as a responsibility. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged, because whatever this was, it did not alter who he was, and that was exactly why it mattered. I will not ask you to serve, Lyra said, her voice steady, unyielding in its clarity, and I will not ask you to change, and there was no condition in those words, no expectation hidden beneath them, only recognition, pure and direct. But I will ask you to stand, she finished, her eyes holding his with a quiet intensity that carried more weight than any command ever could. Not beneath me, not within my system, but beside me, and the meaning settled into the space between them, not as an offer of power, but as an acknowledgement of worth that had already been proven. Ethan took a slow breath, his gaze shifting briefly to the stars beyond before returning to her, and when he spoke, it was not acceptance, not refusal, but something far more grounded. "I will stand where it matters," he said, and Lyra's expression softened in the smallest, almost imperceptible way. Because that answer was not bound to her, not tied to her empire, but aligned with something deeper, something she had only just begun to understand. The chamber remained silent, the council watching, the stars unmoving, and in that stillness, a new balance formed, not of power, not of control, but of recognition, where a human who had been left behind now stood at the edge of an empire, not as a subject, not as a symbol, but as a constant, and for the first time, the universe did not feel divided between species or systems, but connected by something far simpler, far quieter, and far stronger, the choice to remain human, even when nothing required it.